Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to yet another conversation with. Super excited about today's. We're going to be talking with Danny Klein from QSR Magazine, just about what's going on from a journalistic side and what does he see from an industry standpoint as he's hearing all the stories obviously come across his plate. Danny, thank you so much for spending some time with us and giving us some of your stories. So let's just go ahead and start off with an opening statement. How are you doing? What are you generally hearing from people? Do you see positivity moving in any direction? Just some general feedback stuff.
Having me. I'm glad to be here and talk about what we're seeing and just what it's been like covering it from the perspective of a media organization. As far as what we're seeing, I think the positivity is something you've probably seen yourself just from a little bit of the reopenings, and also, some of it is just the fact that things are better than they were, that we kind of crossed the bottom. One of the things about that, though, it's a positive, but there's a ceiling to it, because the reality is that really stems from a couple things. One, there's a higher awareness of to-go and curbside and delivery and those off-premise channels, for the consumer who, maybe was your core dine-in user before, but still wants to support you. And then the other part of that, too, is that some of the higher sales numbers we're seeing is just being measured against a different landscape than early March, when you were talking about a lot of restaurants who weren't equipped to do some of these things and ended up, temporarily closing, hopefully not permanently, but those are things we'll see in the end. So kind of what you're looking at now from a positive angle is that there's a little bit of this is sort of a survivor's field. These are restaurants also that have just taken a lot of steps to improving their to-go and their curbside, et cetera. So they've just become a lot more efficient in how they operate, things along those lines. And then, of course, the reopenings, and, that's providing kind of different levels of boosts, depending on the restaurant chain, depending on the market, what state it is. And, it's one of those things that, of course, 25% is going to be, for a bigger chain like a Chili's, that's going to give them a boost. For a fine dining brand who operating at 25% doesn't, financially add up for the costs involved. It's not really going to help them yet. So, there are a lot of sides to the equation still. I think some operators see some light at the end of the tunnel just naturally from the fact that states are opening up. But, everyone I talk to, there's still a huge element of uncertainty. We don't know how it's going to go, whether or not the reopenings are going to be massive successes, or, will there be some kind of setback, whether that's an external one, like a rise in cases or some sort of media message that comes out there from, officials, or if it's, something internal, like a restaurant, gets associated with someone, testing positive and things like that. So there's still a lot of tiptoeing going around currently with whether or not, we're looking at the COVID, terrain as being in a better place. There's no question it's more positive than it was, but, whether or not it's room to celebrate, there's sort of, some debate there. And I think overall, though, we're headed in a direction where we will have more positive stories coming out, hopefully, and I think that's good news overall to just hold on to.
Danny, from the story perspective, right? You have QSR Magazine. You guys cover an industry that has been impacted as much as any, right, in our economy. But this may be the first time where your magazine, you as a publisher and writer, you guys are part of the story that that restaurants are experiencing. So as a publication, like, how does your internal management team, what do you guys think about what's happening in terms of, hey, we're part of this global disruption. It is impacting our underlying restaurants, right? But it's also impacting QSR, no? Like, so from an organization standpoint, do you guys look at this as opportunity, disruption, change, everything?
So there's two big sides of the coin there. It's not, from basically day one, we've really understood that we are covering something that now is on a different importance level than, at least me personally, our editorial director sometimes talks back to, 2008 and how the Great Recession was something that they would write into stories for seemingly years on end, how this is going, and then compared to the Great Recession. And then that's how this felt at the beginning, but then it took on its own sort of level because it surpassed that, in my opinion, in importance and disruption. So from a business perspective as media, it's kind of hard as a B2B trade publication in the restaurant industry on one level because, of course, we're an ad revenue business, and, the same people who are buying ads are the same people who are worried about the future and are, looking differently at budgets and trying to figure out how are we going to change the message to work with them. And we have a custom content team, and they had to basically go and take the entire way they do things and now reshape the message so that it's relevant, and that it works for readers and that it's helpful and all those sort of things. So, we've obviously, been disrupted there across the board, and that's just as everybody has in the industry, but the other side of that is, from a content perspective, we've pushed more digital content in the last, however, many weeks it's been, than we ever have by, probably tenfold, in that type of span. And our engagement metrics, reflect that, and also just the appetite for learning about what's happening and, how to get through it. And then, of course, just keeping up with the news related to, this kind of insane, cycle that we're living. So on one end, our audience has grown to numbers that are bigger than it's ever been on both of our websites. We also do FSR Magazine, which is for full service. So, that's been almost a more vivid version of this because the full service side is the one that's really been sort of hit like a sledgehammer. A lot of the quick serves, especially the bigger guys, they're weathering it pretty well comparatively or relatively speaking, but it's the independent operator, which makes up the majority of our FSR audience, that's really been, kind of on the brink. So, there have been weeks there, where our digital team is 2 people, and, we've been talking like, it feels like we're almost covering like the survival of, restaurants. And, to a strong extent, that is the case for a lot of people. And so there's a pressure I've felt from that I feel like I have to work crazy hours. I have to do everything I can to maybe write that one article that helps that one person. And that's sort of what I've been fueling myself on, just trying to think, because, you write these stories on how to reopen or, what's the consumer trends. We've done a lot of articles on studies from surveys and things like that. And I realized the sort of the stakes involved, and that was not the case before this. We were writing things that were important to people, and that were very relevant, but it was on a completely different scale of how to run a restaurant versus how to make it through the greatest crisis the industry has ever seen. So, and I've been covering restaurants now for it'll be 5 years in July. But before that, I was a sports writer. I wrote about high school sports in Florida. So for me, I've been trying to educate myself constantly throughout these last, few months. And our other digital writer, I've given him some shout outs online, and he deserves it because he was actually only with us for 3 months before the pandemic arrived. And he's just done an amazing job, working, from 7 to, 5:30 every day, just trying to do what you were saying, which is, educate folks and cover these things and try to it's kind of hard to explain because it's been a whirlwind from start to finish. But so I guess the short answer is that there's an opportunity, I think, for media organizations, especially trade publications in industries affected by COVID, to really earn a loyal following, for people to say, they were there during the crisis to provide us the information we needed. But at the same time, the other side is that it is a struggle still, because the status quo of how you did everything as a media organization was thrown out the window kind of violently. but it'll come back. So those things will level themselves out, and hopefully at that point you'll have a more engaged audience who you can continue to serve, and you may be welcomed in a lot of people that found you through this crisis. So, we'll see how it goes. But yeah, it's been unlike anything I've been through in the 12 years I've been a journalist. So yeah, it's a long story, short, I guess.
Danny, as a writer, obviously high school sports or restaurants, the reality is you've been in the business of telling human interest stories as it relates back to whatever the art is, whether that's a restaurant or it's sport. You're building stories around the human. Do you feel like, as a pure writer, as the artist side of what you do for your career, that the stories are almost more authentic? Like there's no, it's really hard to have like PR BS in this moment because the vulnerability is there. Like, is this allowing you to even have deeper storytelling with people? And then do you think the vulnerability, when people can actually go there, like it's actually going to help them in the end, because maybe they're admitting that everything wasn't as rosy as, the PR firm wanted you to believe it was?
Yeah, there's an element of that for sure. Especially in the early days, the mid-March conversations I had with folks was like talking to people who were some combination of defeated, fearful, and a little bit optimistic. And there was like a shred of that somewhere. So there were a lot of conversations in those first weeks where I've just talked to restaurant owners, and it didn't turn into a story. But we were just kind of chatting about how things were going. And one of the reasons that they didn't always turn into stories is that 3 days later, everything we had talked about was suddenly no longer the case. But I realized that it was almost like they enjoyed just talking. They were at home, they were on their cell phones, they weren't on conference lines set up, things like that. There wasn't another person on the line. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Typically happens all the time, but it was just a different kind of vibe. And it was almost like we were just chatting. It was like being a journalist therapist to a degree, or where we were just kind of throwing ideas back at each other about what we were seeing. Or I got that question a lot in the first month or so that I normally don't receive, which is, what are you seeing from other restaurateurs, or, what do you think about this, or stuff like that. And normally, kind of to your point, a lot of the times, way it works is that you get a story pitch. It's a very specific thing, and the CEO or whoever is already primed to kind of talk about that. So they sort of just go in a straight line of the bullet point kind of comments that they have. So this threw that out the window, because it was just like everyone was struggling. So yeah, it was definitely a vulnerable side of restaurateurs that you probably wouldn't have seen before this. I mean, how that plays long term, I don't really know. But I think that, I had some really good chats with people that will linger past this in my mind, and really shaped how I started to write about things. Again, even when I wasn't telling the specific story of whatever we talked about in articles later on, things that I would write that were not just kind of straight, feature story from a profile interview or whatever. Things that they had said to me would kind of come out in my writing. because the reality is I don't run a restaurant, I never have. I worked in a grocery store once, but I am not I have no background in being like a server. So, the empathy that I write or try to write with at times comes solely from the vulnerability that you mentioned that people share with me. So yeah, it's that whole part of this has been very interesting and heartbreaking at times. I talked to a fine dining restaurant that I had talked to 3 years ago for a cover story, totally different sort of piece. And they just had no idea, what was going to happen. They were doing great things and were confident they would come back, but the amount of uncertainty and the planning and everything that they were worried about was really sort of heart-wrenching, because it just went to show you can be a amazingly successful restaurant that's been around for decades, that the food is great, that you've done everything right with employees and all that kind of stuff, and we're still going to be hanging on the edge of the rail with one hand, because this just what this did to sit down restaurants and mom and pop and local spots. Because one thing a lot of people would say to me early on, is that this is like the great accelerator to sort of get bad restaurants out of an oversaturated landscape, which was something that we were sort of dealing with pre-COVID with some of the bankruptcies you were seeing, mostly on the chain kind of casual side. But, while there's a big part, there's truth in that, what I always tell people is that what you're not really taking into consideration is the restaurant, down the street who makes just enough money to, pay their rent, employees, and themselves every month, and has been doing so for years with no desire to expand, and that's okay, and who they are, and that's who they want to be, and they're the ones who are going to close, unfairly from this. So I've never liked that that viewpoint, and even like the concept that it's sort of pushing technology into places it should have been before. The restaurant industry is too nuanced. It changes too much by demographics and markets and cuisine type and customer type. I mean, there's a restaurant down the street from me that I go there all the time, or did, and it's run by a couple. The wife is the hostess and the server, and they have a bartender and he cooks in the back, and it's that type of place that they don't deserve to close. They didn't need to add to-go technology into their restaurant. So I think people have to always look at COVID and restaurants with a little more empathy than they do, because it is not a broad category or topic, in my take.
Charles, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So Danny, I'm going to put you on the spot, and now you're speaking not only for yourself, but all of QSR Magazine, right? So what you're about to say is official from QSR. 6 months from now, you look back, what's the biggest missed story in the restaurant industry?
The biggest missed story?
What's the story that you guys we're all missing right now?
Oh man.
I know this is an easy question, by the way.
Yeah, I think to an extent it's what I'm talking about, or was just talking about, because the Independent Restaurant Coalition, we've covered them a lot when they come out with these sort of statements that they're asking the government for more help. They did some sort of survey, maybe it was a month ago, maybe less, something where it was like 80% of their polled restaurants weren't sure they were going to survive. And so I think 6 months from now, what happened to the independent restaurant industry? Not that it's not going to have been covered, because it will be, and we'll have written about it. But I don't know that it will have received the same amount of attention as stories like how reopenings are going, or what safety practices should you put in place, or what, the bigger restaurants are doing. What is McDonald's doing to protect guests, or who's adding, what digital feature into their restaurant, things like that. I think the overall sheer devastation to the single unit operator will be the story 6 months from now that we're all playing catch up on. And there are reasons for that too, because going back to, kind of how stories come about, these guys don't have PR firms. So, where is that data really going to come from, exactly to know how many independents close or have to change into something else, or, what's that real estate turning into 6 months from now? Do we, there's been a lot of stories out there, I've written a couple about what kind of opportunity will be on the other side of this for well-capitalized chains, people like, Domino's, who, will have the capital to grow when now there's suddenly a lot of the barriers to grow that were here pre-COVID are down. Landlords are going to want, restaurants like Domino's to come into their, complexes. Chipotle talked a lot about this, where, they want to open drive-throughs, and previously some landlords were a little hesitant because of the traffic and the flow of, cars that it would create, but now they're, all for it. So you have to ask yourself a lot of times in situations like this, and this was true in 2008, where did that real estate come from? Back then, a lot of it was conversions off of casual dining. So now you're asking, is it going to be conversions off of independent restaurants? And my hope is that the answer to that is no, because independent restaurants, I think, make chains better. I think they make the overall landscape better because they push, large corporations to pay more attention to things like quality and way they treat employees and all that kind of stuff. So it would be a very sad and category seismic for the industry to take a huge swath of independence off the landscape. Pizza is probably the best segment to look at there, because that's the only real segment in all of food service of the big ones that there are more independents than chains. So if that shifts, which it probably will, what does that mean for customers and consumers across the country? And that, I think that's going to be the story 6 months from now that will be very hard to understand the breadth of. And we all hope maybe it doesn't turn out to be as doom and gloom as it felt like it was going to be a few weeks back. So, hopefully the reopenings help with that. We just don't know yet. But, if there's a mass closure rate on that sort of side of the restaurant world, it will affect everybody. And that'll be something that will linger and last for multiple years as, the whole industry shifts. I mean, 2008 is a perfect example because it really ushered in the rise of fast casual. And if you look now at what quick service looks like, thanks to that, it's a totally different ballgame, between now and what it was, in 2008, just the quality, the systems, the way the restaurants look. And a lot of that has to do with the infusion of fast casual into the world of quick service. So again, what comes from this? Do we see a hybrid version of full service emerge? It's really kind of hard to say, but I think that's the thing when this is kind of in our rear view mirror that we're going to have to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that you just said, and I'm fascinated by this, is it's this rise of the chain that for so long communities or human beings have talked about kind of being anti-chain, but in the reality, like, that ends up creating sustainability for some of these businesses, that the resources, the technology, it's allowed them to pivot. So I do find that interesting. What I would love your opinion on is, we've seen brands in first party delivery have amazing recoveries during COVID. And my opinion, there is the consumer comfort level that perhaps that when it's going directly from kitchen in with the same employee all the way to my house, maybe I'm comfortable with it. But as I study it, I also think like Grubhubs of the world created a giant mesh of restaurants. So Grubhub ends up being restaurant one. So there's a frequency that I'll give to that. And then I'm giving it to the Domino's, or we've seen like Topper's Pizza or Wing Zone have increases in sales volume because maybe the frequency, they're like, all right, I gave Grubhub my Grubhub restaurant a frequency here. Now I'm going to go give Wing Zone. And what's interesting is their sales are rising in a world where third-party delivery pushed us into this place. Like you have to have it. And the reality is, has third-party delivery, the brands have put it in place, has it helped protect enough so that we could potentially get to the other side? Absolutely. Is it gangbusters? No, the gangbusters is happening on first-party delivery. So does this change the story of first-party versus third-party, and has this brought first-party back?
Well, just to be honest, I hope that's the case. Not that I'm trying to bash third party delivery exactly, but just the simple fact of the restaurant world is that first party delivery is so much more profitable. We have these caps now in some of the big cities on third party fees, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, et cetera. And, they're not, they're temporary things, right? So we'll go back to what it was like before, when there was just so much happening. I mean, we were actually on the verge of running a story that I just never ran because I didn't know what to do with it, post-COVID, that was about how, some of these third-party vendors were listing restaurants without their consent. Is that even legal? That was the question that we were trying to figure out. And the reason they were doing that is because the battle for share, like you were saying, like my Grubhub restaurant, that was such a fierce competition that was taking place that, in the marketing that was being pushed out by, the aggregators was something that restaurants couldn't really compete with. And it was bearing the question of what was the sustainability of these free delivery deals and, these different incentives to get you to look at, Grubhub or DoorDash or whomever as being your, restaurant of choice, like you said, for that platform. So every restaurant, and I've talked to a handful of people who during this process added first party delivery for the first time in their history. And there's also been a whole bunch who signed up with third party for the first time. It just kind of depends on what you're capable of, if you have the operations to deliver your own food or not. That's obviously sort of where the line is drawn. But yeah, I mean, anyone that you chat with, I think the restaurant world and the places themselves would like for first party to be the place where the consumer goes if they're going to order from them. And I think to what you said, is very valid, but there is a certain, we've seen this in studies that we've written about, that there is a certain level of wariness from a consumer standpoint, with COVID and the health concerns of the third party, because the driver is a little bit of a mystery. That was the same deal as like, back in the day when they were showing up and, someone took a bite of the pizza, whatever. Obviously that's a totally different ball game now, which is why the tamper evidence seals and all that kind of stuff has stepped up. But still, you don't really have a great, grasp as a consumer of what that driver is doing protocol wise, from picking up your food to bringing it to you. And still, I think overall it's got, it's obviously safer than going into the restaurant, from most people's perspective, but it's also not as safe from most people's perspective of if you know that it's an employee of a restaurant that you trust. So, if you have a favorite spot and you call them and they first party deliver, you're probably going to feel a little bit better, about it. And I think that's what's given rise really to, the curbside. Curbside has probably been the single most talked about thing I've heard from restaurants during this process, just how powerful of a tool it's been for them, sort of like this makeshift drive-through model that they built in the, outside the, door. It's been very effective for a lot of restaurants who are in mall settings. They just set up like a sort of like a run through there where you can just pull up and they'll just put the food in the back of the truck, that kind of stuff. And that comes back to the same overall concept that it's, if I trust this restaurant, then I'm probably going to trust them to give me the food too. So you're cutting out a layer with first party delivery that I think is really important to a lot of people. And one thing that COVID might do is simply alert people to the fact that that's an option, because they may have said to themselves, oh, I haven't had this restaurant in a while, let me look them up online. And then they see the big message on the website that says, we now deliver. And now 6-7 months from now, they may think, maybe I want to get delivery from this restaurant, that typically before was a one option sort of deal for them, which was, do I want to go to it or not? So first party delivery, whether or not, what kind of prominence it holds after this, I think depends a lot on the restaurant, whether or not it was something they invested in now and they saw a lot of consumer uplift from. And if they did, then I would assume that it's going to hold, and it'll stay sort of into the future. And it'll be like an incremental kind of business to their dine-in. And that's the goal. That's sort of the core of the optimism for a lot of restaurant folks, is that when the dine-in returns, will my to-go sales also still be higher? And the probability of that is that they will lower from where they are now, of course, but will they still be higher than they were before? And the answer to that for a lot of people will probably be yes. So that's when you hear people say, like, we just got to get to the other side and we may be in better shape. I think that's what it stems from.
It's interesting, the shifts that are going on, because pre-COVID, you had the expensive real estate, you have the emergence of ghost kitchens, you have the third-party delivery, everything shifting in a pattern where the box becomes sort of less expensive, the brand's important, the food, but that experience. And now we have a massive disruption of consumer behavior, and it's going to be interesting, because does this disruption reset, like Nick's point about third-party delivery, does it reset that relationship, or does it accelerate it even more? Danny, can I ask you a politically incorrect question? With yes or no response, which, by the way, never agree to a yes or no response because it's never correct. But from a philosophical standpoint, and knowing what we know about your concern about the independents, should brands like Shake Shack and Ruth's Chris Steakhouse be punished for the way they operated with the PPP?
So this is just a yes or no question?
It's a no-win yes or no question.
My answer to that is no.
Okay. All right. It's no win there, right?
I'll give you 2 reasons why really quick. Number one, they gave it back. So, you can fault them for taking it, but hey, you also got to give them a little bit of credit for giving it back. But the second part of that too is that they didn't really have a reason to not take it. There was no guidance. I read something yesterday that even with the guidance now that you will be penalized for keeping it, there's still 30 public companies who are planning to keep their loans regardless. So those companies, I would say.
But Danny, is there a bigger story there where, we're a multi-million dollar, well-capitalized entity? We are now, especially Ruth's Chris, which I found the most obnoxious, right? So you got Ruth's Chris setting up 2 entities to double up, get 20 million, right? And we're now going to use our leverage with Chase and these other banks, who also deserve a smack in the face from the individual independent restaurant owners. You should never go to Chase or these other banks, Go to your local independent banks because they turned their back on you. And then these big brands that didn't need the capital squeezed out the mom and pops at the moment they needed it the most. When all these brands were doing were adding additional capital to their bank accounts.
Yeah, there's no way that they should have gotten money or been eligible to get money.
No, but doesn't good leadership pause at that moment? Doesn't it pause?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm trying to think.
Every millennial out there should never eat at Shake Shack.
Yeah, but I think Charles, what Danny said. I mean, look, here's the truth. Going into it, do I think their intention was let's block out all independent restaurants? I don't think that was the intention. I think at fault one is the bank, because what the banks did is the way that at least the guidance was based on first come, first serve. There were probably other businesses as the onion gets peeled back and discovery happens. There were probably other businesses that got trumped by a Ruth Chris. That's the wrong part. I don't think they're wrong there. And then when Brand X says I give it back, I think that softens it, because they're like, hey, look, we didn't know at the order it was going to come. We didn't know that small business was going to get wrecked in this first tranche. And then the last thing, and I think the last point on it is, what I would have liked to see, especially on a franchise side, which that happens to be our bulk, I would have liked to see if corporate's getting the money, how they're going to leverage that to support the franchisees, because the franchisees are the ones in those situations that their pockets go like this. They're the independent owners in those situations. So some brands did come out and really, really give scaffolding around the franchise owner and say, let us help you get the PPP. But I'm with Danny on the front end. I think it's the banks that screwed up that. I don't think they were wrong in that, especially when they tried to make right later on. Now, I think part of that is a PR story. And frankly, they get more than $10 million in PR value instantly by saying we're giving the money back. Genius move. But I don't know that it's their fault.
Yeah, well, I mean, Shake Shack had said, they wrote that letter afterward that said, we didn't know it was going to run out of money or we wouldn't have applied. So you can choose to believe them or not. Same way you can choose to believe they gave the money back because of the public outcry or because of their conscience, which one you want to pick. I mean, I have no idea. No one's going to ever know the answer to that. But it's true, a lot in the bank scenario, it was set up, unfortunately, in a way that they favored people they knew would give them the money back.
Yeah.
and that should have never been even an option, but it was, and on the franchise side, I've talked to a lot of people on that level where their role was to help the individual franchisees secure loans. And I think that gets an unnecessarily bad rap from some people because they don't sometimes understand the franchise side. And a lot of those operators are basically like single mom and pops running a corporate entity with some support on the back end to it, and they pay royalties, et cetera, all those things. But, they needed the money. It wasn't like their whole company was getting it. They were getting it. But yes, I think overall that was a totally corrupt and terrible process. And the second round, we'll kind of gauge it, maybe in a couple weeks.
No, I think the second round's working, right? It's still, shockingly, it's still funded. I would challenge that for QSR and everyone in general. And again, I think I'm being over extreme, which my sad part is I won't eat at Shake Shack again. And I love their food, right? But
you heard it here first. You cannot change that. When you get hungry for that burger.
I deleted the app. I actually post on Danny Meyer's LinkedIn too. But I will say that, when you are publicly traded, you have that equity, there was no need to rush right into that funding. And I would challenge this to a whole generation of reporters and writers out there. it'd be a compelling story and maybe even a book to write about Shake Shack and Roots Chris and the banks and what happened as the mom and pops lost their lifelines.
Right. Yeah, because the worst part about this second round that doesn't get talked about enough is the fact that it's come too late.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the fact that the first round was such a disaster and then they worked to get it, blah, 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 you got to reapply, et cetera.
And Danny, everyone at Roots Chris and Shake Shack slept well, whether they got the money or not. But the mom and pops who couldn't sleep for a month and lost their business, I don't care about the PR stunt that happens after the fact, right? I love Ossobuco ravioli at Roots Chris. We'll never eat there again.
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from, and I don't think you're alone. It just, it just when I remember when it first happened, it was one of those things. I remember we were talking sort of internally. It's like, are we surprised this happened? For some reason, we're not. It's almost like if you didn't think that was going to happen, you hadn't been paying attention to how things had been going, and it was completely and utterly terrible and unfortunate. But I was not stunned by it at all, sadly. So. And I talked to someone about that exact thing that, we just mentioned, where it said, okay, there's another round, but I'm out of business. So,
well, I mean, if I were, and, the local community banks, right, whatever trade association they have, they should put together an ad budget and run ads with you guys talking about how the local community bankers stood up for the local restaurant owners, right?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Buy an ad, everybody. Take that.
Well, I think you said it here first. You're going to give it away free, right?
I think this is, unfortunately, this is page 1 of that book, though.
Yeah.
Because like to take the restaurant that Danny is talking about, where the bartender's the cook and the hostess is the owner. Like, unfortunately, call it irresponsible, and there was an irresponsibility on banking. There are some businesses that are not going to be able to be equipped to be a restaurant brand on the other side of this. That's probably a story that's going to come out of this. Exposure and education that there's independently owned and operated franchisees on the back end of some of these businesses that get labeled as big business, that the communities just don't understand that it's actually Nick or Charles's or Danny's burger brand at the local level, that they're like, that guy's making a ton of money. You're like, cool, but 5 cents of every dollar goes to royalty, 2 cents of every dollar goes to an ad fund, 2 cents of every dollar might go to a technology fee. Already every dollar to that local owner is only worth 90 cents. Oh, and in the restaurant business, you're lucky to make 10 to 15% net. So on $100,000, you make 10. So on $1 million, that owner is making probably around $100,000. Like, there's things here from an education standpoint that I hope it's not like a restart or anything like that. Like, this is disruption to everything, and my hope is that we can settle in a place that creates more responsible business on the other side of this. And I think a lot of brands got fat and happy during this time. They went from 2011, 12, and 13 of $700,000 AUVs to now up to $1.1 million, but never put the funds away for a rainy day. So there's like fundamentals that hopefully come through this that make us better on the other side. And I personally look forward to reading those stories. And obviously I look forward to Danny, you telling them. So
yeah, me too. But I think the franchise segment in general is one of the most misunderstood elements of American business. Just from people I talk to who are not in the restaurant sphere, they don't, that disconnect that you mentioned is very much a real thing. Yeah. People, they'll say like, he's running I don't want to really pick one brand, but he's running this fast food chain, so he's got to be rolling in money. And I'm like, actually, he's probably not. He's probably healthy and fine and comfortable financially, but this is not exactly what you think it is. But yeah, to your point, I think that we'll see something along the, in 2008, you had this sort of there was a restriction of retail in America. So, with e-commerce, but there was a boom of restaurant locations, and that came from similar things you're going to see in the real estate landscape. And what that did, unfortunately, was create a lot of terrible restaurants or restaurants that were not operating effectively or shouldn't have grown, or said, I'm going to jump from 5 to 50 units in 2 years because I can, and I've got this investor, this private equity, but my product isn't good and I don't have anything else figured out, but we'll get there when we get there. And that's where we were really running into that. We were bumping that leading to COVID. You saw there was a lot of bankruptcies last year, and there was also a lot of M&A activity with pulling public restaurants into the private sector. And a lot of that had to do with what happened in 2008, which was, it opened the floodgates for, operators who didn't have everything figured out just to grow aimlessly. So with that said, hopefully we see sort of a reverse of that out of this, where the people who are growing they were forced to figure it out during this. And then we have a more positive story to tell. But, we have no actual idea what's going to happen, who's going to be that brand, which sector and segment is going to ride that kind of tailwind or not. So, there's just so much still left to happen, right now.
Yeah, I think that's the defining line. There is so much left to happen, and maybe some of those good old brands that people forgot about, like pizza delivery. Maybe there's resurgences here that it was time. So anyway, Charles, final thoughts.
Yeah, Danny, I hope you feel better, but I really appreciate the input. I think there's a bunch of stories going on, right? And so I think your point, Nick, about rise of the chain, that's a story there, right? And there is a new value proposition, franchisor, franchisee. So that'll be an interesting story to watch. For me, unrelated story is, there's a new hero in the book. I think the community banker now has a role as a hero. I think big banks, Chase and whatever, they have a new role as a villain in the story of entrepreneurship. So I'm going to be curious how this story plays out. I'm rooting for all the businesses and the brands. And also I think the other story is that franchisees are small business owners just as much as anyone else. So, I'll be looking for these stories. I'll be looking for your book, Danny, as you attack Roots Chris and Shake Shack, and when that comes out. But I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. I just encourage people to look at our websites. This content has slowed down a little bit as I've been sick, unfortunately. But
Danny, there's room for great stories about great franchise law firms. You could be writing about them and stuff. No, I'm joking.
I have talked to a lot of attorneys in the last 3 months, more than I had ever talked to before.
Yeah, that's not fun.
Well, and Danny, next time I'm going to give you control of the mute button just in case you want to silence Charles as he goes out on his rant. But thank you so much. Big fan, obviously, of QSR and FSR. And we appreciate everything you're doing to be a storyteller on the front line. So, Danny, thanks for joining us.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Danny. Thank you.